Now, StackBlitz is a fantastic tool. If you aren't familiar with it, I highly recommend you spend a little bit of time and get familiar with it. The most important part to understand is it's basically a little Visual Studio editor inside of a browser. Let's head over to stackblitz.com. I'll just show you very basically. If you scroll down here and click Angular, this will create a brand new Angular project. And that's a great way to start up a quick project and play around with Angular and try various things. So I highly recommend you spend some time doing just that. But let's look at what we've got here. We've got our app component HTML. That's what we're displaying. And here's an H1, which is some static text. Now, static text is great, but a web application is really about dynamic pieces of data. Data that either changes or has changed, and we're displaying that data rather than hand writing up some HTML. And that's called data binding. And that's the core purpose of Angular and other front-end frameworks, is to bind that data and display it to the user. So static text like this is not really what we want. What we really want is to display data. Now let's head over to our app component.ts file. This is our component itself that goes along with that HTML file. And it is an empty class. It has no information, no data in it. Let's give it a movie title property. Let's set that equal to Batman and Robin. All right, now if we want to display this data inside of our page, and StackBlitz will help us out because you can see over the right-hand side, we've got a preview of what our Angular application is doing. So we're going to come over to our HTML file, and we're going to change this so that instead of displaying Hello World, it's going to display hello and then the name of that movie title. So I'm going to remove the word world. And again, let's review what that property looks like. It's movie title, case just like this. I'm just going to copy it. I'm going to paste it over here. Now, if I just paste that in, you can see over the right, we just get the static text movie title. What we really want is for Angular to take that data that's in that variable and actually render that data out in the HTML. And we do that with the special binding syntax of double curly braces. So I'm going to put 2 curly braces before and 2 after. And now see what's happened over on the right. Angular is interpolating that data. It's actually grabbing the movie title variable and sticking it into this HTML right here. That is the basics of data binding. And we use this type of syntax all the time. This is a very simple syntax for just rendering text into an HTML element. But that's only half of the kinds of data bindings that we want to do. For example, what if we have a button that says best movie ever? But we want that button to be disabled because we don't want anybody to be able to click Best Movie Ever for Batman and Robin. So our application might have a corresponding property here, Best Movie Ever, and that's going to be set to false. This is not the best movie ever. Back in our template, we want to somehow take that property and bind it to the button's disabled property so that we can disable the button because the best movie ever property is set to false. Well, Angular has a special syntax for doing just that. Remember, we want to bind the disabled property equal to that best movie ever variable. And we do that by binding it using these square brackets. But we need to take that Boolean variable and not it, because we're binding to the disabled property, not an enabled property. So when best movie ever is set to false, we want disabled to be true. So we can do that by simply putting an exclamation mark to not that variable right here. And now you can see that the button is disabled. If I come back into my component and change this to true, now the button is enabled and I can click it. But if we set it back to false, the button is disabled. This is property binding. Now, something that's very important, you may have noticed when I didn't have the square brackets, then the button was still disabled. That's just because of how HTML attributes work. In this case, this is an HTML attribute and I'm setting it to something. But the way that the disabled attribute works is if it's present at all, then the button is disabled. But that's not what we want. When we leave it without the square brackets, no matter what value we put in here, true or false, the button is disabled. What we want to do is actually bind to the disabled property, and we do that with those square brackets. If we put those back in, now we're binding to the disabled property, and when we have it as true, then the button is enabled. When we have it as false, the button is disabled. So it's important to understand the difference between an HTML attribute, the disabled attribute, and the disabled property of the button. If you're very familiar with the DOM API, a button has a disabled property that's different than an attribute. The disabled attribute simply works by whether it's present or not, but the property is a Boolean value that's either set to true or false. And here we're binding to that disabled property. Now maybe instead of disabling the button, we want to just hide it altogether. Well, there's a DOM property called hidden that we can bind to. And when best movie ever is set to false, then hidden is set to true. And when this is set to true, then hidden is set to false and the button is now available. That's just one of the many properties that we can bind to on an HTML element using Angular, and we can take data inside of our component and have that data determine the display of our application. Now, one more thing that's important to understand here is the difference between the two types of binding that I've shown you. The first example with the double curly braces is interpolation or string interpolation. Angular just sticks the value of whatever I tell it to right into the HTML. We typically use this when we want to display a piece of data. Property binding, on the other hand, with the square brackets, is for binding to properties of DOM elements, like setting the hidden or disabled properties. Both types of binding are useful and necessary, but they're used for different purposes. This will become more clear as we learn more about Angular.